Hello, Broken One Ministries. How may I direct your call?
Hi, this is Travis. I need to speak to Prophet.
Um, okay, is there anything that I can help you with before I put you through?
No, he knows who I am. Can I just speak to him, please?
Okay, one moment.
I'm here. After the unfortunate death of Liz, I slid further and further into hopelessness. All the days started blending together, and I started fighting the strings less and less. I felt like I was both being dragged around physically by the strings and mentally, so I just gave up fighting. Creole seemed to notice that as he tried to get some kind of reaction out of me, but I gave him no satisfaction at all with anything that he tried. That seemed to annoy him at least, so I got that small victory. I might have fully surrendered to the strings if a familiar face hadn't shown up to the shop. When the rusty bell jingled, I didn't bother looking up from my staring contest that I was having with the voodoo doll template on the counter. That was until the sound of little feet running over to me tore me away from this exhilarating game. Little Olivia stared up at me with her sweet, innocent little eyes. Wow, you look like Mr. King Creole, she gasped. I'd almost forgotten the girl and her new British mother. I looked at her, and the first smile in a couple of days came to my face. She returned my smile and looked over to her mother as she came over to me. Her mother's look, however, was one of sorrow as she looked at me, covering her mouth with her hands. I I couldn't stop him, I sighed as I pointed to the strings forcing me to stand. She reached out and held my hands in hers as she offered me some comfort. It felt nice to have someone touch me, someone who didn't immediately hit me with a hard wooden cane. As if to further push that train of thought, King Creole himself emerged from his office, a big wide smile on his face. Olivia, darling, he said with a big cheery grin, coming over as the little girl ran to him and wrapped her little arms around him. Now don't you worry, dear. I know what day it is today, he said with a soft chuckle, petting her head as he knelt down to her level. She looked up at him flabbergasted. You know today is my birthday? She asked with a smile. The voodoo shop owner nodded and stood back up, looking over at me and Olivia's mother, a finger coming up and wiggling and wagging at the two of us. Olivia's mother quickly dropped my hands and stood back. She clearly feared the creature just as much as I did. He smiled when she was finally away from me and turned his attention back to Olivia. Why, of course I do. Now come along, darling. I've got the perfect present for you, Creole said, taking Olivia's hand and leading her to the office. Her mother followed after them and soon enough left me alone once the office door was closed. Alone once again. Well, at least someone had showed me some kindness. It felt really nice. The trio emerged from King Creole's office and chuckled as Olivia thanked him a million times over for her gift wrapped present, smiling down at her and then over at me, his button eyes meeting mine, and he chuckled. Well, how about a story before y'all leave for your birthday party? He asked her, looking down at Olivia, who quickly nodded and jumped up and down, handing the gift to her mother and really just wanting to hear his story. Travis, my boy, bring that rocking chair and your old stool over here, he ordered me. I nodded and brought the two chairs over, Creole taking the stool and Olivia climbing up into the rocking chair. Once upon a time, there was a man named Charlie, he began, a soft chuckle leaving his lips as he looked up at me and Olivia's mother. We both looked away from his commanding gaze. Now, Charlie loved playing the piano. Now, he wasn't very good at first, but he kept practicing and practicing. Day after day, he played the same songs over and over just to get the movements of his fingers down perfectly. And one day, he did it. Why, he mastered the piano. The voodoo man smiled, lifting his fingers up and mimicking like he was playing the piano. Wow, couldn't he have just wished to be better at the piano? Olivia asked the storytelling voodoo man. He let out a howling laugh, causing me and Olivia's mother to flinch. "Mm, Why, no, darling. My mama always said life can't be solved with a wish. Now, you got to roll up your sleeves and get it yourself." Charlie knew that, and he never stopped practicing and getting better. He even started his very own band. He smiled, seeing Olivia with stars in her eyes. He smiled back and continued. He even fell in love and got engaged. But life isn't always fair to hard-working people like Charlie, he sighed, leaning back in the rocking chair and letting it creak. Now I and you all, especially you, Erica, already know this story. We know who Charles Sumner was, and we know who he became. I knew this very well in my futile attempt to stop my fate from happening. So why was Creole telling an abridged version to Olivia, especially on her birthday of all days? The brutal murder of Charles Sumner isn't exactly the kind of children's story I would tell a kid. What happened to Charlie? Olivia asked, now concern plastered all over her face as she scooched closer to the edge of the stool to look up at King Creole. The voodoo man's smile grew as he let the chair rock him closer and closer to Olivia. Little old Charlie won a contest that gave him a lot of money. He was going to use that money to buy him and his fiancée a nice plot of land with a house on it. But Charlie's little lady friend was very, very naughty. She wanted that money all for herself, he said, his smile straining his stitched up mouth as his rocking on the chair continued. She decided to get her secret boyfriend to steal the money from Charlie so they could keep it all to themselves. At that line, my buttons instinctively drifted over to the basement door. Mary had been punished for her crime for close to 100 years at this point, and it seemed like there would be no end in sight for her. Who was that Greek mythology guy? The one whose liver got eaten by that giant bird every day? Prometheus, I think. I guess that's what kind of punishment old King Creole dishes out. So, on the night he won the contest, Charlie was brought to a bar to celebrate, and have a party with people he thought were his friends. Then he took then they took him out to the woods. The smile on the pale voodoo store owner's face dropped a bit. Then they started beating him, saying all manner of horrible things to him. He tisked, shaking his head and looking at Olivia, who was captivated by every word being spoken to her. Did they kill him? The little girl asked. Clearly, she was smarter than her years let on. She could tell where this story was going. Not right away. They beat him, and when they realized Charlie had gotten a very good look at all their faces, they picked up some sticks and stabbed them into Charlie's eyes. You cannot imagine the pain Charlie felt. His so-called friends hurting him this badly. Creole sighed, taking his top hat off and running his gloved hands through his messy black hair. Only the problem was that didn't kill Charlie. Oh, he screamed and he screamed. Why, anyone would have if that had happened to them. The people hurting him panicked again. What if someone heard that? What if they came a running? Creole quickly put his hat on and sat up straight as he looked down at Olivia. Did someone come to save Charlie? The little girl asked, hugging the doll of her old mother that never left her side. I was also on the edge of my seat. Even though I knew the outcome, what can I say? He's a damn good storyteller. No, nobody did. But they were so scared that they'd be seen and caught that they had to act fast. One of them grabbed a rusty saw from the back of one of their trucks. The others held Charlie down, shoving his face into the mud. And they started cutting. Only there was a problem. The saw was duller than they were, and it didn't cut well at all. He sighed, and that made sense looking at him. The cut to my neck that Creole gave me is nice and smooth. He did it with a nice sharp saw. His own cut, however, why, it's jagged and uneven in places, like someone really had to force it to be cut. How long did it take it to end? Olivia whimpered. Her mother came over to hug her from behind to calm her down, the little girl burying her face in her mother's dress, but still keeping one eye looking over at Creole, obviously still fascinated by the story. Oh, it took a very long time, darling, Creole said. 30 minutes from when the saw started cutting to when Charlie's poor head fell off his shoulders. They covered his body under some leaves and sticks and left him there, he said, holding his hands up as if that was the end. But he continued, another smile spreading across his face. But they didn't account for his mama. I raised a brow at this. Creole never talked about his mother. It was something that sent him into a fury whenever me, and especially when Mary, brought it up. But here he was telling a little girl all about his elusive mother. Me and Olivia's mother were obviously curious. Charlie's mama was very skilled in the arts of voodoo. She was loved by everyone for healing the sick and helping the needy. And when she learned that her son was missing, oh, she sprung into action. She found Charlie's body within a few days of him going missing. But she didn't report it to the police. Oh, no, 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 he tisked, wagging his finger at all three of us. She took him straight back home, and she fixed him right up, bringing him back to the land of the living. Olivia gasped and started clapping in excitement, looking up at her mother like it was a miracle. Now, Charlie was very upset at what had happened to him. He worked so hard all his life and he'd been taken advantage of. Well, he decided that it was his turn to have that fun. He chuckled, looking up at me with a smile. He made everyone who killed him suffer, especially his fiancée and her secret boyfriend. He hummed with a smile. If he'd done something to this horrible person, speaking about the boyfriend and his friends, of course, and to Mary, I could only imagine what he'd do to me. Wow, what did Charlie do when he was done? Olivia asked, setting her doll in her lap and looking up at him for an answer. He smiled down at her and tousled her hair. Why, he decided to teach everyone the same lesson he learned. Taking the easy way only gets you punished, he said with a chuckle, looking over at me and Olivia's mother. Why, your new mommy learned that the hard way. Your new mommy left her old family and moved to America to start a new life just for herself. Now, look at her. She's the best mother you could have ever asked for. He smiled, Olivia nodding back quickly and turning to hug her new mother nice and tight. Her new mother, who looked over at me and nodded sadly. And what about him? What did he do to get turned like that? She asked, pointing at me and then looking at Creole. I looked at him, expecting some bullshit thing I had done to deserve this. What he said, though, made me want to pull out the switchblade I've been hiding this whole time and just stab his fucking heart out. Him? Oh, that was just me feeling a little bit selfish, he said with a giggle, standing up and walking past me as the strings tightened and forced me to stand in place while he said his goodbyes to Olivia and her mother. Both of them left the shop. He approached me and wrapped his arm around my stiff body. Travis, my good boy, let me tell you, your parents called me once again. They're begging me to help them find you. I think they might even come over here again. Who knows? If they ask for a wish, I just might grant it. He chuckled, grabbing my face and pulling it over to look at him. He smiled wide as he squished my cheeks. You wouldn't dare, I choked out, managing to fight off the string's influence enough to say that. That got a hard laugh out of him. He smacked me across my face and caused me to go limp against my will. He put his dress shoe on my face and put hard pressure on my cheek. I wouldn't dare, he asked after laughing at me for a good while, putting even more pressure on my head. If you weren't my sweet little pet, I would have already gutted you like a fucking fish and used you for a voodoo doll, he hummed, reaching down and grabbing me by my hair and pulling me back up. Listen here, if you so much as try anything with Mary, I'll kill your parents right in front of you, he said with a smile, dropping me back on the floor and fixing his tie. I struggled to push myself up and looked up at him, gritting my teeth and trying to think of a way to fight back against him. And what I said is the reason I haven't called and recorded in a while. Your mother would be fucking disappointed that this is what you're doing, I said to him, and instantly regretted it when he stopped in place and looked back at me, his teeth grinding hard as he came over to me, grabbing his cane from seemingly nowhere and started to beat me with it. That was normal when he got pissed off, but this time he dragged me by my suit collar and then dragged me down to the basement. You will not speak of my mother, he growled as he tossed me down to the floor of the basement and snapped his fingers. The strings of my body pulled tight as he suspended me from the floor. I'll make sure that filthy mouth of yours is kept shut. He smiled as he produced a needle and thread. He stabbed my lips with it and sewed my mouth shut tight and left me dangling from the ceiling for 2 straight days. Mary managed to cut the threads on my mouth with the porcelain shards that she always kept near her. After he'd calmed down, he dragged me back up the basement steps and shoved me towards the counter, pointing a gloved finger at my face. The voodoo human doll that was King Creole delivered a threat to me that has left me chilled to the bone. You so much as speak out of line, and I will turn your parents into dolls and burn them right in front of you, he snarled, stepping away from me and letting his threats seep in. He means it, and he has the ability to do it. I need to stop him. I need to kill him. Let me get this straight, and for the record, I don't know how to do any kind of voodoo. It's not like King Creole has how to do voodoo books lying around everywhere. And let's just say the internet has been even less helpful. Anything I try just ends up with me getting beat by my beloved boss when he discovers what I try to do. So that's completely off the table for me. Though it would have been cool to give him the same shit he's been giving me. So far, the only thing I have going for me is the switchblade and Mary. That old porcelain girl has plenty of fight left in her if her ambush of Creole was anything to go on. Plus, I still have the key to the basement that my little template voodoo friend gave me. Creole seemingly hasn't noticed, or he has an infinite amount of keys because he easily goes down there every day to beat Mary and to do his usual messed up shit down there. So when he went down there today, I expected to hear the usual shattering porcelain sounds, but I didn't hear it this time. I heard a piano. Now, let me tell you something. Hearing any kind of music break the deafening silence of the shop was like hearing the voice of an angel. I turned back to look at the basement door and raised a brow as to where the hell a piano had come from. I'd been down there a lot. There ain't no piano down there. I walked over to the basement door and found it open. Now, that was very strange. Well, he hadn't told me not to come down there, so I silently walked down the steps. The sounds of a sweet yet sad tune played and grew louder the closer I came towards the floor of the basement. I stopped just short of the final step and pressed myself up against a stone wall, peeking my head over to see what was happening. And my jaw hit the floor faster than an anvil from the sky. The basement looked completely different. No hanging bodies, no bones, no rotting corpses, nothing. Instead, it was a concert hall, like a full on giant concert hall. Seats with cushions with people sitting in them and watching. Not real people, obviously. Each one of them had a stitched up mouth and button eyes. Most likely, he made an audience out of the bodies that had been, disposed of down here. I looked over to the stage and my buttons nearly fell off because playing the piano wasn't King Creole, it was Charles Sumner. Well combed hair, skin tanned, normal eyes, and a big smile on his face as he played the piano. Needless to say, my confusion was immense, but he played the piano so beautifully. It was hypnotizing. I looked around for a place to sit and found one next to one of the guys who had once wished for $1 million and ended up getting hit by a car right after. He said nothing as I sat down. I kept staring at the stage, my button eyes soaking in the scenery of something that had only happened in the 1920s when Charles was still alive. I can see all that practice really paid off for him. It would have been a lovely concert, maybe one for the history books. That is, until Mary descended from the ceiling to the stage with wires attached to her. Unlike Charles, who was all smiles and soaking up the opportunity, Mary looked sad and almost unwanted in a way. And yet she too was human again, the very definition of beauty, with golden blonde hair, pale skin, and a white dress. When she landed on the stage, finally she took a step forward and looked back at Charles. He ignored her and kept playing his heart out. Mary sighed and looked out to the crowd. I'm not going to do this again, Charles. I hate it, she said finally, causing Charles to miss the stroke of the key and then snap his attention over to her. Standing up, I felt my blood run cold as he pushed away from the piano and started to walk over to her. I reached down to my shoe and removed the switchblade. Yes, I've been hiding it in my shoes the whole time. It's what he gets for giving me way too big shoes. Listen, you whore, Charles snarled from the stage. His anger was obvious and emanating from him. He walked over to Mary and grabbed her by the throat. The woman gasped and started to hit him on the chest. You know what today is, and you damn well better sing, or I'll make sure this eternal punishment of yours becomes even fucking worse, he snarled, some of King Creole slipping out into Charles Sumner. Good. At least I'll finally be free of you, she choked out, rising another hand to strike him only for him to intercept it and toss her to the ground. The woman coughed and hacked, soon an entire chunk of her face falling in her hands, her skin cracking all over the place, and soon enough, she was back to her porcelain form. Very well then. Oh, Travis! Charles suddenly asked, spinning on his heels and looking at me. I froze and quickly shoved the knife into my pocket, looking around and seeing that every person in the crowd was looking at me. Come on over here, boy. I require your services, he chuckled, walking back over to the piano. Sitting down with some dramatic flair, he began playing some practice notes. Those notes sent my strings trembling as soon enough I was forced to stand up and walk over to the stage. My button eyes looked at Mary as I passed her and took her place on the stage. I looked then over at Charles, who walked and waved back at me and started up the music again. The second he did, the strings pulled tighter than ever and began to force me to dance. Now, normally I can't dance. I look like a thrashing fish more than anything, but the strings forced me to dance as elegantly as any professional dancer. This wouldn't be too much of a problem, except for the fact that every motion the strings made me do caused me more pain than I can even begin to try and explain to any of you. Each and every pull of those strings felt as if each limb was being pulled out of their socket along with my skin being pulled off with a potato peeler. I screamed with each and every pull of the string. Each and every dance move, each and every tone of Charles Sumner's piano keys was like another peel of my skin. Mary watched in horror as I screamed and begged for him to stop. She looked between me and Charles before she finally stood up. Stop! Enough! I'll sing! She finally said, causing Charles to stop and turn to her. By extension, this allowed me to stop as well. I collapsed to the floor, crying and whimpering at just how much pain I was in, my entire body limp and throbbing in blinding white pain. Mary walked over to me and carefully put her hand on me, flinching away when I hissed out in sheer agony, "You better start before I fucking force him to do it again," Charles threatened, his fingers hovering over the keys and ready to force me up once again. The woman waved him off, helping me sit up before she backed up. Looking out at the crowd, Mary sighed and took a deep breath, and she started to sing. Not like lyrics, but like an opera singer might. It was incredible, just like Charles's piano playing. They went together in perfect harmony. Charles started to play it again while Mary sang her heart out. I just watched from the stage, completely enraptured as my aching body healed from my abuse. It was something that you can only really experience if you were there. It was as if Beethoven and Mozart cooperated together to create something made of pure beauty. It was heavenly to think a monster like him could produce something so beautiful. With one final soft aria, Mary finished, and with a flurry of keystrokes, Charles finished. He stood from the piano, stepped away from it, and bowed to the crowd, the corpses standing up and clapping. "Happy birthday, Mama," he said to the ceiling, lowering his head, and in a short breath, the stage was gone. I don't know how he did it. I can't even blink. And yet, in the blink of an eye, the basement was back to its normal, horrible self. Creole was back as well, putting his top hat on his head and sighed out from his nose. That explains why he went through all of this. "Hope she's burning in hell as you'll be," Mary spat, causing Creole to swiftly turn around and bitch smack the hell out of her, sending shards of porcelain to the floor and causing Mary to fall back into the wall, and she herself fell to the floor. Creole then turned to me, fixing his tie again, and smiled. "As if this whore wouldn't be joining me," he chuckled, walking past me and towards the stairs, his steps heading up, most likely back to his office. I went over to Mary and helped her back up, handing her some pieces of herself, which she thanked me for. "I'm guessing he does that every year?" I asked her, sitting down next to the porcelain woman. She nodded as she laid her head back against the wall that we were sitting up against. "His tribute to her for bringing him back to life and for being a good mother, I guess," she explained, looking over to me with her only eye and sighing, shaking her head and looking over to all the bodies and bodies once again lying around. "I'm no better than him. I eat anything and anyone he sends down here just to be able to grow back any piece of my body. If I really wanted him to kill me, I would just have to stop eating. And yet, here I am, still, after all these decades," she said with a sorrowful chuckle, looking over to me and reaching a hand out to touch my face, sending me flinching a bit, but she softly rubbed my red painted cheeks. "Those look good on you. Some much needed color." "Would rather have some real color," I chuckled, letting her touch me for a second before pulling away. I don't know if it's because she's my only other contact in this horrible place, but it's comforting to know that she cares about me, at least enough to stop my suffering when she can. Our moment was interrupted by a hard crack to the back of my head, sending me falling in her lap. As I looked up, I saw Creole snarling down at the both of us. "Trying to steal my pet, whore?" he asked, raising his cane and striking her harder, growling as he struck her hard enough to shatter a good portion of her face. I looked over once I regained myself and saw what he'd done to her, and I acted. Pulling the switchblade out of my pocket, I brought the blade up and grabbed King Creole by the shoulder. Turning him around, he looked at me in absolute confusion and fury as I slashed at his throat with the blade. I managed to cut almost the entirety of his front stitches, causing a big spray of black liquid to come flying out of his throat and causing him to stumble forward and onto the floor, clutching his throat as he did so. "You, you idiot! What have you done?" He choked out, staring up at me with the rage of a cornered animal. Acting on impulse, I kicked him in the head and broke further stitches, causing more of the liquid to ooze out of him and causing him to fall flat on his face as he bled out. I backed up and dropped the knife, looking over at Mary. She was putting her face back together and staring in awe at what I had done. That didn't last too long, as the voodoo man pushed himself back up, his head dangling down by his shoulder and chuckling up at me. He stood up and fixed his head back easily, pulling out his threads and needle and leaving the items to stitch up his neck on their own without him even having to touch them. I backed up from him, quickly reaching down and grabbed the knife again. "You really risk the lives of your family for a whore like her?" he asked, clearly pissed off royally and trying to hide it behind a forced smile and little laugh. When the floating needle and thread were finished, they dropped themselves into his hand and he carefully put them in his pocket. He reached down to the floor and dusted off his hat, placing it on his head with a smile. He looked over at me cheerfully and then lunged at me and shoved me to the wall with the force of an 18-wheeler. I tried stabbing him again, but he simply took the stab through his hand and looked at me. "Why aren't you dead?" I asked as I kicked my legs at him. He answered with a chuckle and a pat to the cheek. "Takes more than that to undo my mama's work," he answered, looking back over at Mary to make sure she wasn't going to do anything to try and save me this time. Then, looking back at me and looking at the knife embedded in his hand, he ticks at me again. "Looks like I'm paying your parents a visit." He chuckled, backing his head away from my own as I tried to headbutt him, bite him, anything. "Don't you fucking dare, you psycho!" I shouted, desperately trying to get out of his death grip. But he just watched and laughed like an animal playing with his food. He had the upper hand on me, and I had lost my only advantage against him. He tossed me to the floor and stomped on my head with his dress shoes as he looked down at me. "Why, I'll do you one better, Travis. How about I bring them here? Show them that you're alive and well. Then, how about I have you kill them for me?" he said with a maniacal and evil giggle, grinding his heel into my skull and causing me to thrash and try to fight him off. But I felt the pull of the strings, and my angry growls and curses turned into a big smile. "That sounds perfect, sir. I'll get the tools ready for you," I happily said as he lifted his foot off of me and let me stand back up. He smiled as he looked at me and nodded. "Ha, that sounds excellent, Travis. Why, I bet they'll be so happy to see you. Just imagine the looks on their faces as you slice off their skin and help me turn them into dolls," he said with another childlike giggle. I wanted to wrap my hands around his head and crush it with the force of vice, but all I could do was nod, click my heels, and salute him. "I can't wait, sir," I declared. He nodded and tousled my combed hair, turning and starting to walk upstairs before he suddenly stopped and turned to look at me. Travis, be a good boy and bring Master his cane, he said with a hum, producing a nice toothy smile as the stitches on his mouth strained to breaking point. I turned my head to look at the item sitting on the floor, turning back to him and finally walking to get it, picking up the cane and handing it back to him. Now that's a good boy, he said, walking upstairs and leaving me. The knife was still stabbed in his hand. Well, I fucked up. I wasted my only chance to kill him, and now he'll be back with my parents at any moment. And it's all my fault. I should have fucking decapitated him. Maybe that would have worked. I don't know anymore. I've been laying on the floor of the shop for about 5 minutes now, just crying. Well, I was. But I think I have one more chance. My little voodoo doll template friend has just produced a scissor blade for me. I'm sorry I ever say anything about anything bad about you, little guy. I have a chance. I'll save you, Mom and Dad. I promise.